The young and the restless spoilers. Jack Newman sat behind the broad mahogany desk in his private corner office at Jabot Cosmetics, the late afternoon light filtering through floor-to-ceiling windows and painting his stern profile in amber hues. Across from him, Diane Jenkins perched on the tufted leather settee, her posture taut with the same unease that creased Jack's brow. Neither of them spoke at first. The silence was thick, laced with the unspoken conviction that the future of the company, and of their family, hinged on the words that would finally break free. At last Diane inhaled sharply, smoothing the folds of her tailored blouse before meeting Jack's gaze. "Kyle, as CEO," she began, her voice soft yet carrying the weight of conviction, "was supposed to be an interim measure. A bridge between your tenure and a more permanent arrangement under our stewardship. But the board's faith in him has taken on a life of its own. He thinks he's earned the right to keep the seat indefinitely." Jack's jaw tightened. Since handing the reins to Kyle a year ago, partly out of necessity, partly out of paternal pride, he had watched his son step into the role with an earnestness born of youthful ambition and a desire to prove himself worthy of the Newman legacy. Yet with every quarterly report and every marketing campaign rollout, Kyle's confidence had swelled into something bordering on hubris. Diane had been the first to notice that his strategic decisions were increasingly colored by inexperience and an eagerness to win approval, rather than by the cold, hard pragmatism that had guided Jack through decades of boardroom battles. "I should have known," Jack murmured, leaning forward, fingertips pressed together. "I should have seen that once he tasted it, he wouldn't let go." He shaded his eyes as if staring directly into Kyle's future missteps and unsanctioned expenditures, the same meticulous hand he had used to craft Jabot's ascent now trembling involuntarily at its own undoing. "We need a contingency. I can't afford to let our flagship brand fall prey to reckless gambits simply because he wants to outshine me." Diane nodded, the lamplight giving her hair an almost ethereal glow. "We need to consider how to approach him without annihilating his confidence completely," she said, choosing words with the precision of a lawyer drafting a settlement. "If we force his resignation, he'll see it as a personal betrayal, and the family fractures will become irreparable. But if we allow him to continue mismanaging budgets and alienating key clients, the damage to Jabot's reputation could be catastrophic." The conversation unfolded like a high-stakes negotiation, with both participants weighing every syllable. Should they enlist support from long-standing board members? Should they leak concerns anonymously to gauge the temper of shareholders? And worst of all, how would they bear the weight of this choice, sidelining Jack's own son in order to protect the empire they had built together? Unbeknownst to them, not 2 floors below, Kyle Abbott worked late in the glow of his glass-walled office, the city skyline forming a glittering panorama behind him. Tasked with finalizing the annual projections, he had taken to burning the midnight oil, determined that his stewardship would be remembered for triumphs rather than for the inevitable reputation of nepotistic privilege. But as the minute hand crawled past 11, a faint echo of voices drifted from the hallway. A muted urgency that pricked at his instincts. Curious and unable to ignore it, Kyle left his office, closing the door behind him with a deliberate click that he hoped would announce his presence if the speakers were whispering about him. What he found instead was an empty corridor and the soft hum of the elevator shaft. Drawn by a mixture of dread and obligation, he pressed his ear against the veneer of Jack's door, lips parted as if to catch every inflection. At first, the words were indistinct, Jack's firm timbre counterpoint by Diane's calmer but insistent suggestions. Kyle's heart hammered as fragments of the conversation sharpened: force his resignation, irreparable fractures, mismanaging budgets. The world tilted beneath his feet. He pressed himself closer, eyes widening as the final damning phrase tumbled through the crack of the door: "He'll never accept stepping down. We need a way to make him believe it's his idea." Rage coiled in Kyle's chest like a viper ready to strike. The betrayal stung sharper than any boardroom critique he had ever faced. After all the nights he had spent proving himself, after every battleground he had won against outside rivals, after every risk he had shouldered in service of the company, their solution was to undermine him entirely, to manipulate him like a pawn. He stumbled back into the lobby, every footfall resonating like thunder in his ears, but suppressed the instinct to burst into Jack's office and confront them head-on. Instead, he willed himself to tread lightly, his fists clenched so tightly at his sides that his knuckles turned white. As he passed the reception desk, he forced his breathing into calm, controlled inhales, reminding himself that any outburst now would only validate the very narrative Jack and Diane were weaving. That he was too emotional, too inexperienced to lead. And yet, beneath the veneer of composure, a simmering impulse took root. If they wanted a confrontation, he would give it to them and not on their terms. The following morning, the Jabot boardroom buzzed with the quiet intensity of pre-meeting chatter. Executives in tailored suits exchanged curt pleasantries as they arranged their folders and tablets around the polished conference table. Jack took his seat at the head, shoulders squared and eyes steely with resolution. Diane slipped in beside him, offering a terse nod of solidarity. Kyle entered moments later, his gait purposeful, his face schooled into an expression of polite confidence. The tension stretched taut, visible to all, like the silence before a symphony's opening chord. As Jack cleared his throat to begin the quarterly review, Kyle watched him with a wary curiosity. He had drafted his own memo overnight, bullet-pointing the successes he had achieved and the strategic vision he intended to pursue. But as Jack launched into projections, highlighting revenue dips in emerging markets and flagging concerns about overspending on influencer partnerships, Kyle felt the room tilt again. The board's collective attention drifted toward him, and he realized in that instant that the stage was set not for a discussion of progress, but for the performance of his downfall. Jack paused, eyes meeting Kyle's across the expanse of polished wood. The room hushed. Diane, seated one seat over, clasped her hands in her lap, fingers trembling with the same anticipatory dread that had kept them both awake the night before. Then, with a voice calm yet yielding a hidden undercurrent of steel, Jack spoke, "Kyle, your contributions have been significant, but we're facing a crossroads. The brand needs steady leadership, and I've been asked to reconsider my decision to step down." Murmurs rippled around the table as executives exchanged surprised glances. Kyle felt his pulse spike, his palms flush. Jack continued, "I'm prepared to reassume the role of CEO, but only if it's the consensus of this board and, more importantly, if it's what you want." The phrase hung in the air like a gauntlet thrown. The implication was unmistakable. Kyle was being offered a way out that would appear voluntary, but in reality it was the culmination of the very conspiracy he had overheard. Kyle took a breath so deep it felt as though his chest might crack. Every instinct told him to nod in humble acceptance, to bow to the weight of legacy and relinquish the seat he had staked his identity on. But the betrayal he had felt, the sting of Jack and Diane's clandestine plotting, coursed through his veins like molten steel. He rose from his chair, his figure casting a long shadow across the room's pristine surfaces. "I appreciate the offer," he began, voice ringing with a clarity that silenced the murmurs, "but I didn't come here to be anyone's placeholder. I came here to lead. If that's not what the board wants, then perhaps we should address that directly. I won't step aside under the guise of my own choice when it was never the plan to begin with." Shock flashed in Jack's eyes, and Diane's lips parted in a silent gasp. The board members shifted uncomfortably, caught between the spectacle of familial strife and the real stakes of corporate stewardship. Kyle's words hung like a challenge. He pressed on, feeling courage swell despite the maelstrom in his gut. "You trusted me with this company, Dad," he said, turning his gaze squarely on Jack. "You said you believed in me. If you no longer do, I'll face the consequences, but I won't be undercut by backroom schemes." The silence that followed was heavier than any report or forecast. Diane's throat bobbed as if she were swallowing regret. Jack's jaw set, torn between paternal love and the cold judgment he believed necessary to protect Jabot's future. Minutes stretched into an eternity as the board awaited a resolution. Finally, Jack rose, the weight of his legacy and his love for his son etched in the lines of his face. "I trusted you because I saw potential," Jack said, voice thick with emotion. But business isn't built on sentiment alone. He turned to the rest of the board. Let's postpone this decision for now. We'll reconvene after due diligence reviews. No changes today. With those words, he both postponed the reckoning and acknowledged Kyle's right to be heard, a tenuous truce in a war waged behind closed doors. As the board members exhaled collectively and the meeting adjourned, the family stood amid the hushed murmurs of confusion and relief. In the aftermath, Jack stepped into the empty hallway, pulling Kyle aside. Their eyes met, father and son locked in a silent understanding. The fortress of Jabot had never been built on simple trust but on a balance of power that now trembled dangerously. Diane emerged to place a gentle hand on Jack's arm, her expression a mixture of sorrow and solidarity. Kyle, watching them, felt the first real fracture of his confidence, but beneath it, something irrefutable. He had stood his ground. And whether they admitted it or not, the game had changed. From that day forward, nothing at Jabot, and in their family, would ever be the same. The air between them crackled with the remnants of Kyle's fury long after the boardroom lights had dimmed. Jack and Diane sat rigidly at the head of the table, their carefully orchestrated contingency unraveling before their eyes. Jack's usual composure had slipped when Kyle's voice, ringing with insolent conviction, had echoed off the polished walls. I will not vacate this seat. I will prove to you, to everyone, that I am capable of leading Jabot. Diane's cheeks had paled as guilt flickered across her features, and Jack's throat had worked in a desperate swallow. They both understood, in that jarring moment of exposure, that they had underestimated their son's resolve, and that their secretive whisperings had betrayed the very trust they claimed to uphold. Kyle stormed from the boardroom like a tempest unleashed, his tailored jacket whipping behind him as he barreled through the marble foyer. Each stride bore the weight of his wounded pride, each breath he drew was fueled by the raw determination to vindicate himself. He refused to look back, refused to grant his parents the courtesy of reconciliation or explanation. He had heard the murmur of their doubts and the calculation behind their plan, and it had stung more sharply than any public rebuke. In his mind, stepping down would confirm their worst suspicions, that he was merely a placeholder, an appeasement to family tradition rather than a visionary leader in his own right. Meanwhile, Clare Newman had followed Kyle into the hallway, her heart pounding at the sight of his retreating shoulders. She recognized the fire in his step, the rigid set of his shoulders, the way his jaw clenched against tears he would never show. Fear coiled in her chest, for she knew the consequences of Kyle's wrath, and the peril it posed not only to him but to the delicate truce that held the Abbott family together. She longed to reach out, to plead with him to temper his anger, to remind him that love and loyalty could still bind them, but she paused at the threshold of the boardroom's glass doors. This was not her battle, it was the war of the Abbotts, fueled by power, by legacy, and by the scars of privilege. Clare understood, with both the clarity and the helplessness of someone who stood on the periphery of a familial crusade, that any intervention might be construed as betrayal, might drive Kyle further into isolation or spark a confrontation far more devastating than whispers in a darkened office. She watched him cross the lobby and disappear into the cool evening air beyond the grand entrance. His silhouette receded into the urban dusk, leaving her alone with the echo of her own powerless heartbeat. A single teardrop slid down her cheek, its warmth a sharp reminder that blood ties did not guarantee unity or safety. Inside the boardroom, Jack and Diane remained seated, the hum of the building's ventilation system the only sound to fill the void. Diane's hands trembled as she pressed them against her lap, and Jack rested his forehead on the cold tabletop for a moment, his mind racing through the fallout that lay ahead. They had gambled on expedience but forgotten the human cost. They had prioritized corporate stability over paternal trust. Now, with Kyle's defiance ringing in their ears, they faced a crossroads far more perilous than any market downturn. Forging ahead with Kyle at the helm meant risking further fractures in their family. Forcing him out would mean not only the collapse of his confidence but the potential dissolution of the only bond that had ever truly mattered to Jack, that between father and son. As twilight deepened beyond the plate glass windows, the Abbotts braced themselves for the reckoning to come. Kyle's battle cry, so forceful and unambiguous, had marked the opening salvo in a conflict that would demand every ounce of cunning, every measure of stubborn pride, and perhaps, if any hope remained, a willingness to forgive. Yet with Clare standing silent witness to the extraordinary blow struck against her family's foundation, the future of Jabot, and of the Abbotts themselves, hurtled toward an uncertain dawn, bound by power plays that left no room for middle ground and no promise of reconciliation. Clare stood beneath the broad oak beams of the refurbished barn, its wide doors flung open to the pastel haze of late afternoon, as Victoria and Nicky took their places on the weathered bench that had once held milking pails and feed sacks. The scent of fresh hay mingled with the soft musk of spring blossoms drifting in on a warm breeze, lending an air of promise to the gathering, and yet, as Clare's voice rang out, it carried the weight of both relief and regret. "I've been thinking," she began, the sunlight catching in her hair so that each strand glowed like spun gold. "Kyle and I aren't going to move in together, at least, not right now." She watched her mother's expression tighten, saw the flash of disappointment in Victoria's eyes as she clasped her teacup more tightly. "It's not an argument," Clare hastened to add, her tone gentle. "I just want to pause, to slow everything down." Victoria's lips pressed into a firm line, her posture growing more rigid. She had witnessed Clare's eagerness to seize every opportunity, to carve out a place beside the Newman name, and she knew how often that momentum had crashed against Victor's indomitable will. "You're postponing," Victoria said quietly, yet the tremor underneath her calm betrayed the mother's frustration. "Because of your grandfather's whims. Because he demands everyone dance to his tune." Nicky exchanged a glance with her daughter, her expression both sympathetic and cautious. "Clare," she said, "you've done this before, yielding to someone else's mandates until your own heart feels muted." The old pain in her voice was unmistakable, the memory of too many delays, too many second-guessings born of deference to a patriarch whose approval had become the ultimate arbiter of worth. Clare drew in a steadying breath, her fingers curling around the hem of her dress as if to ground herself in the here and now. "Perhaps," she admitted, eyes downcast, "I'm afraid we're moving too fast." The words trembled on her lips as though they had been carried on the wind from a darker place, a place where impulsive leaps had led only to fractures. "But I don't want to be unwise. I want this to work, for all of us." She lifted her gaze to Victoria's, searching for solidarity rather than admonition. "I need my grandfather to see that I make decisions with care, that I'm not just another foot soldier in his endless campaign for control." Victoria's stern facade softened into something warmer, a mother's concern threading through her sigh. "I hope," she said, voice rough with emotion, "that these choices are truly yours, born of your own desires, not of the necessity to please or placate." Clare's heart fluttered as she turned to Nicky, whose eyes gleamed with admiration. "Let me help," Nicky offered, her tone firm yet tender. "I've seen how fiercely you fight for what you believe in. I'll stand with you, even if the world thinks you're defying the man who wrote your history." Victoria's nod was small but resolute, a silent acknowledgement that family bonds could, and must, transcend fear. Clare squared her shoulders and felt a surge of determination brighten her pulse. She stepped onto a raised platform once used for hay storage, as if ascending to claim her own voice. "Then let's make something of this moment," she declared, her words echoing against the breeze. "I want to throw a party, a celebration of new beginnings, under the lanterns in this very barnyard. We'll invite a few close friends, the people who believe in us, and show Victor that I'm not shirking from life, I'm forging it on my own terms." The barn fell silent for an exquisite heartbeat before Victoria exhaled, a tremor of pride seeping into her features, and Nicky's smile bloomed like a dawn chorus. The golden light of dusk wove through the rafters overhead, and as Clare looked from her mother to her grandmother, she finally sensed the alchemy she sought, a future shaped not by hesitation or by fear of disapproval, but by the unbreakable circle of the women who loved her.